Confirm the weight on this pallet.
It matches the manifest exactly, Commandant.
Very well. Secure the shipment for Berlin.
Why is this taking so long? Open this vault immediately.
The legend of the Nazi gold. We've all heard the legends. Whispers passed down through half a century of history books. Rumors buried under snow and time. A lost Nazi train sealed in a tunnel in Poland. A U-boat heavy with treasure resting on the ocean floor. Or a secret bunker filled with gold somewhere deep in the Bavarian Alps. These are the stories that captured imaginations long after the guns of Europe fell silent. But the truth, the real truth, is not a legend. It is colder, darker, and far better documented than the myths ever told. Because the story of Nazi gold isn't about a single missing fortune. It's about the organized looting of an entire continent. It is the story of a machine built to devour the wealth of nations and the possessions of millions, to turn human lives into the raw fuel of war. In March 1938, that machine roared to life. Across Austria, people woke to the sound of boots echoing in their streets. Tanks rolled through Vienna's narrow avenues, their engines rumbling like thunder in the early dawn. Posters of swastikas replaced the flags of an independent nation overnight. The world called it the Anschluss, a polite word for invasion. But beneath the speeches and cheers, a quieter operation was already underway. Inside the marble halls of the Austrian National Bank, men in black uniforms with eagles on their sleeves arrived with typed orders. Within hours, they were weighing gold bars, opening vaults, counting coin reserves that represented the life savings of an entire people. 78 tons of gold were transferred, not stolen in the dark of night, but seized in daylight under the guise of legality. The documents would describe it as annexation of assets. In truth, it was the beginning of the largest gold theft in human history. To understand the scale of this, you have to understand what gold meant in the 1930s. It was the bloodstream of nations, the guarantee behind every currency, every import, every soldier's paycheck. To strip a nation of its gold was to paralyze it. The Nazis knew this. They didn't just want land or factories. They wanted control over the very pulse of Europe. In those early days, the thefts were surgical, clean, and administrative. Bank ledgers were signed, safes sealed, and gold moved to Berlin aboard guarded trains. But as the years unfolded, as the war widened and moral lines blurred, the theft would grow monstrous, transforming from economic annexation to moral annihilation. At the top of this machine sat the Reichsbank, the beating heart of Hitler's financial empire. It was led by Walter Funk, a man whose signature would appear on the orders that drained the vaults of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. Funk saw money not as a national trust, but as a weapon. Every bar of gold meant more tanks, more aircraft, more ammunition to feed the war's insatiable appetite. To the ordinary Austrian banker forced to hand over the vault keys, the day felt almost civil. No shots fired, no blood spilled. Yet in that silence, an entire country's sovereignty was erased, not by the barrel of a gun, but by the clink of metal bars sliding into German crates. The gold was transported to Berlin and cataloged with meticulous precision. Each bar weighed, numbered, and recorded. The Nazis were not mere thieves. They were accountants of plunder. Their efficiency gave their crimes a sense of order, a bureaucratic mask that made the theft appear almost legitimate. But beneath that paperwork lay violence, the quiet violence of empire, the theft of a nation's future. The world watching from afar did little. In London, in Paris, in Washington, diplomats argued over whether Germany's absorption of Austria was an internal matter. No one wanted another war, and so silence became complicity. The vaults of Vienna were emptied while Europe held its breath. What began in Austria would soon spread across the continent. The Nazis realized that gold, unlike ideology, crossed borders easily. It could be traded melted hidden. It could pay for oil from Romania, steel from Sweden, and tungsten from Portugal. It could keep a war alive long after reason had died. And as Hitler's empire grew, so did the mountain of stolen gold in Berlin. To the outside world, the Reich seemed unstoppable, a modern industrial power expanding with terrifying precision. But behind that machinery was a network of theft, one that turned the suffering of nations into the balance sheets of conquest. By the spring of 1939, just a year after the Austrian annexation, the same scene would replay in Prague. Once again, German troops crossed the border. Once again, men in gray suits entered a national bank and demanded the vault keys. Only this time, part of the Czech gold wasn't even in Prague. It was held in London at the Bank of England for safekeeping. The Nazis simply requested it be transferred to their account at the Reichsbank, and astonishingly, the Bank of England complied. They didn't want to provoke a conflict. They thought appeasement would buy peace. It didn't. These moments, often lost in the vast chronicles of the war, show how the conquest of Europe began not only with tanks, but with signatures and telegrams. The first battles were not fought in trenches, but in ledgers. The war machine was financed before the first shot in Poland was ever fired. Yet what makes this story so haunting is how ordinary it all looked. No drama, no bloodshed, only paperwork and silence, the kind of evil that wears a suit and balances accounts. Still, history remembers differently. When people think of Nazi gold, they imagine adventure tunnels, treasure hunters, secret maps. But if you strip away the romance, what remains is something far more human and disturbing, a civilization's moral collapse measured in bars of gold. Because this gold was not just metal, it represented hospitals that would never be built, pensions that would never be paid, children whose futures were traded for bullets. Every ounce of gold that crossed into Berlin carried the invisible weight of those it was taken from. And in the years that followed, as the Reich expanded westward, the theft would evolve from the vaults of banks to the pockets and bodies of human beings. From here, the story moves beyond nations into the realm of atrocity, where the value of gold and the value of life became indistinguishable. That is the true legend of Nazi gold. Not a buried treasure waiting to be found, but a mirror reflecting what humanity is capable of when greed wears the uniform of authority. The question that will echo through every chapter of this story is not, where is the gold? It's what did we lose when we took it? The Austrian vaults and the birth of a financial empire. Vienna, March 12th, 1938. The morning air was cold and heavy, the kind of gray that dulls the edges of a city. The streets were still wet from the previous night's rain when the first German columns rolled across the border. The Anschluss had begun. To the cheering crowds, it looked like unification, a long-awaited homecoming of German-speaking brothers. But behind the flags, behind the orchestrated parades and speeches, there was another kind of invasion taking place. One that left no craters, no corpses, only empty vaults and signatures on forged documents of consent. Within hours of the Wehrmacht entering Vienna, agents of the Reichsbank and the SS Economic Office walked into the Austrian National Bank. They carried no weapons, only papers stamped with the insignia of the eagle and the swastika. Their mission was not conquest by gunfire, but by calculation. Inside the vaulted halls, marble floors echoed with polished boots. The officials moved through corridors lined with safety deposit boxes, ledgers, and the quiet tremor of disbelief from Austrian clerks forced to comply. Orders were read aloud in clipped German all-monetary gold foreign currency reserves, and securities are to be transferred immediately to the Reichsbank. By sunset, 78 tons of gold, the accumulated wealth of a nation, were on their way to Berlin. It was described as an administrative reorganization. In reality, it was the first chapter of a continental heist. But it wasn't only the vaults that were stripped. The Nazis moved with bureaucratic precision through private banks, confiscating Jewish accounts, freezing foreign holdings, and demanding inventories from jewelers and goldsmiths. Nothing was too small to matter. They even targeted the Central Synagogue's charity fund, seizing every coin. To the Nazi leadership, Austria was a test case proof that financial conquest could be faster and cleaner than military occupation. The entire operation took less than 48 hours. No shots, no resistance, no declarations of war. Only an eerie silence broken by the sound of train wheels carrying a country's fortune north. Walter Funk, soon to be president of the Reichsbank, saw in this efficiency a blueprint for the future. He called it the integration of European capital under German stewardship. The phrase was meant to sound like economics. In truth, it was the language of theft dressed up as policy. Each gold bar taken from Vienna was recorded numbered and re-stamped with the emblem of the Reich. But the physical gold was just the beginning. Austria's factories, mines, and businesses were quickly absorbed into German corporate networks. The annexation of wealth was total, and economy devoured overnight. Still, to the outside world, it appeared bloodless. Newspapers in London wrote cautiously about economic alignment. American diplomats referred to it as monetary unification. The euphemisms masked the reality: a nation robbed at gunpoint while the world looked away. In the days that followed, the Nazis celebrated their success with characteristic arrogance. Propaganda films showed smiling Austrians welcoming their liberators. The camera never showed the trucks leaving the National Bank or the Jewish families being forced to list their valuables for registration. Beneath the pageantry was a dark efficiency, the merging of political power and financial control that would soon fund the coming storm across Europe. The theft of Austria's gold was not about greed alone. It was about leverage. Gold was the one universal currency, the resource every neutral nation trusted. With it, the Reich could purchase the materials it couldn't produce: oil, tungsten, copper, and steel from the few countries still willing to trade. And there was another motive. In the mind of Hitler and his ministers, control over Europe's gold meant control over its future. They envisioned a continent financially dependent on Germany, its economies tethered to the Reichsmark. To build that empire, they needed more than one vault. They needed them all. Within a year, the same pattern unfolded again. On March 15, 1939, German troops marched into Prague. The occupation of Czechoslovakia was swift and silent. Inside the stately building of the Czechoslovak National Bank, officials from Berlin repeated the ritual they had perfected in Vienna. They demanded access to the vault. 45 tons of gold waited inside. But some of that gold wasn't even on Czech soil. Years earlier, the Czechoslovak government had deposited part of its reserves in London for safekeeping in the vaults of the Bank of England. The Nazis knew this. With chilling audacity, they sent a telegram to London requesting that the gold be transferred to their account at the Reichsbank. And in an act that history still struggles to explain, the Bank of England complied. Out of fear of interfering in foreign affairs, they moved the gold. No soldier crossed the channel, no bomb fell on London, yet a moral line had already been crossed. For Hitler's regime, the lesson was clear: gold could win wars before they even started. Over the next months, Berlin's vaults filled like reservoirs. Officials boasted that the Reich now controlled more than half of Europe's monetary reserves. Economists called it the financial Anschluss. But for those living under occupation, it meant starvation rationing and the slow erasure of sovereignty. In Vienna, the old bankers who had watched their life's work disappear were replaced by party loyalists. Many of them would later manage similar takeovers in Warsaw, Brussels, and Paris. The system they built here in the heart of Austria became the financial backbone of a regime preparing for total war. One Austrian economist writing secretly in exile compared the Nazi economy to a furnace fed with gold. He wasn't wrong. Every conquest that followed Poland, the Low Countries, France, would throw more fuel into the fire. But behind the grandeur of Berlin's expanding reserves lurked a deeper rot. The men who managed this plunder believed they could quantify everything: resources, labor, even life itself. In their ledgers, human suffering became a column of numbers. Efficiency replaced morality. And as they counted their bars of gold, they were already planning the next step, not just to rob nations, but to rob individuals, millions of them. Soon, they would turn from national treasuries to private belongings, from bank vaults to human pockets, from confiscation to extermination. That transformation from looting governments to looting the dead would mark the moral descent of an entire civilization. But in early 1938, standing in the Austrian vaults, no one could see that far ahead. To the Nazi officials loading crates onto trains bound for Berlin, this was victory. They believed they were building an empire destined to last 1,000 years. They believed history itself could be bought and stored behind steel doors. They didn't know that decades later, those same trains would become symbols not of triumph, but of shame. That their meticulous records, the signatures, and weight receipts would one day be used as evidence of the greatest financial crime in modern history. For now, though, the vault doors slammed shut and the lights went dark. The Austrian gold was gone, and across Europe, in the boardrooms and ministries of neighboring nations, uneasy men read the reports and realized the truth. The Reich had found a new kind of weapon, one that didn't need to fire a single shot. The race for Poland's gold. September 1st, 1939. The sky over Poland burned red. Sirens wailed across Warsaw, and the thunder of artillery rolled through the dawn. The Second World War had begun. Yet even before the first bombs fell, another battle was already being fought. A desperate race, not for land, but for gold. The Poles knew what had happened in Austria and Czechoslovakia. They knew the Germans would come not only for their borders, but for their banks. Inside the vaults of the Polish National Bank, 75 tons of gold glittered under electric light, the savings of an entire nation, the foundation of its currency, the backbone of its sovereignty. To lose it would mean financial death before the first soldier was lost. So, in the final weeks before the invasion, the Polish government made a fateful decision. The gold had to be moved fast, quietly, and far from German reach. In late August 1939, while diplomats in Europe still clung to the illusion of peace, railway workers under military guard began loading sealed crates into armored train cars. Each bar was catalog numbered, recorded in trembling handwriting. The destination was uncertain, the route a labyrinth. The plan was to move the gold south through Romania, then west through the Balkans, and finally to France and Britain. It was a journey of thousands of miles through territories already bracing for war. When German troops crossed the border, the trains were already moving. Soldiers guarding the convoy described the eerie silence as the Polish countryside erupted in chaos. Behind them, columns of refugees, burning villages, the distant hum of Luftwaffe bombers. One officer wrote in his diary, "We were not soldiers, we were ghosts carrying our nation's soul. By sheer determination, they succeeded." the gold escaped. It crossed rivers, borders, and front lines. Some was shipped across the Black Sea to Istanbul, then to France, where it would help fund the Polish government in exile. It was a small miracle amid the catastrophe of invasion, but not every country would be so fortunate. For every shipment that slipped away, a dozen were captured. The Nazis learned from their failures and moved faster with each conquest. By 1940, their armies were no longer content to take territory. They came equipped with accountants and bankers. Wherever the Wehrmacht went, a special detachment of financial officers followed, tasked with seizing national reserves, private banks, and even church treasuries. When the Blitzkrieg struck the West in May 1940, it wasn't only soldiers and tanks advancing, it was the shadow of the Reichsbank itself. The Netherlands fell first. In Amsterdam, officials scrambled to move the Dutch National Bank's reserves, but the Germans arrived too quickly. 163 tons of gold were seized within days. The ledgers were neat, the process efficient. Every bar weighed every coin, counted every crate sealed with wax bearing the Reich eagle. Belgium fared little better. Their reserves, worth more than 220 tons, were sent to France for safekeeping. But when France itself fell, those same gold bars ended up in German hands. The Nazis captured them intact, the spoils of nations neatly stacked in railway depots waiting for transport east to Berlin. France's loss was the greatest of all 754 tons of gold, the largest single seizure in the war. The Germans even forced the French central bank to continue operating under occupation, processing its own plunder under orders from Berlin. To the Nazi bureaucrats, it was all perfectly legal. They called it economic realignment. But the paperwork couldn't disguise the truth. This was a campaign of financial annihilation. Every vault opened every bar, cataloged every nation stripped to its core. In Berlin, the gold poured into the vaults of the Reichsbank like a river of molten sunlight. Officials celebrated the numbers. The Reich now held over 1,000 tons of foreign reserves, more than any other power in Europe. They believed this gold would secure a 1,000-year empire. Yet beneath the grandeur of their ledgers lay a dark irony. Much of that gold, Dutch, Belgian, French, had once been minted to represent liberty, equality, and the faith of free nations. Now it was melted, stamped with the swastika, and turned into bullets fuel and propaganda. The Reich didn't just steal wealth, it stole meaning. Across occupied Europe, the consequences rippled outward. Currencies collapsed. Families lost savings overnight. The economies of the conquered were chained to Berlin's. What couldn't be bought with diplomacy would now be bought with stolen gold. And through it all, the world hesitated. In London, ministers debated whether to freeze German assets. In Washington, isolationist voices argued that Europe's troubles were its own. Neutral countries continued to trade with the Reich, and the gold continued to flow. Every coin that crossed a border carried blood on it. Still, amid the devastation, there were acts of quiet heroism, small flickering lights in the darkness. Bank clerks in occupied Poland destroyed records to protect Jewish customers. In Norway, employees of the central bank secretly altered ledgers so that when the Germans arrived, the vaults appeared nearly empty. In France, resistance members hid small caches of gold coins meant for the families of executed partisans. They knew they couldn't stop the machine, but they could at least preserve a fragment of dignity against the tide of theft. By late 1940, Europe's gold had been reshaped into the skeleton of a war economy. The Reichsbank's vaults held more than just metal. They held the illusion of invincibility. In their eyes, gold was proof that history itself favored them, but it wouldn't last. The gold they hoarded came with ghosts attached, and the ghosts would not stay silent, because as the war dragged on, the easy thefts ended. There were no more national vaults left to rob, no more banks to seize. Yet the hunger for gold for financing the war only grew stronger. And so, in 1942, the Nazis turned inward toward the camps, toward the people they had condemned as less than human. The next wave of gold wouldn't come from vaults beneath cities. It would come from the teeth rings and watches of the dead. The race for Poland's gold had been a prelude. The real horror, the moral bankruptcy behind the Nazi treasury, was still to come, because the greatest fortune the Reich ever amassed would not lie in national reserves or bank accounts. It would be melted down from human history itself. The Blitzkrieg and the Western Flood of Gold. Spring 1940, Europe held its breath. For 7 months after the fall of Poland, there was silence, a deceptive calm that journalists called the phony war. But in the Reich Chancellery, there was nothing phony about what was coming. The Wehrmacht was preparing to unleash a lightning storm across Western Europe, and the Reichsbank was already making room in its vaults. The Blitzkrieg lightning war was not just a military strategy. It was also a financial one. Speed shock and precision, these principles didn't just break armies, they broke economies. Each conquest was designed not only to seize territory, but to drain the victim's veins of gold before the world could react. On May 10, 1940, German tanks roared through the Ardennes. Within hours, radio operators were transmitting coded messages not to generals, but to bankers. Special detachments called Wirtschaftstruppen, economic troops, moved in behind the armored divisions. Their orders were clear: secure the vault, seize the gold, and ship it to Berlin. In The Hague, Dutch officials worked through the night, packing gold bars into crates. Their last telegram to London read simply, "We will try to save it." But before dawn, German paratroopers dropped onto airfields surrounding the capital. Within days, the Dutch National Bank was under Nazi control. 163 tons of gold changed hands. In Belgium, the story was the same, only faster. The Belgian treasury, fearing invasion, had sent 223 tons of gold to France months earlier for safekeeping. But when the Germans reached Paris, they found those very bars stacked neatly in French vaults. The gold was seized without resistance. France's fate, however, dwarfed all others. In June 1940, as the French army collapsed and German troops entered Paris, officials from the Banque de France faced the unthinkable. Their vaults held 754 tons of gold, the largest national reserve in Western Europe. In a panic, convoys were sent south toward Bordeaux and Toulouse, but most were overtaken. The rest was confiscated under the new puppet regime in Vichy, which obediently turned its wealth over to the Reich. It was the grandest theft ever carried out under the guise of diplomacy. The Nazis didn't act like looters. They acted like auditors. Every bar of French, Belgian, and Dutch gold was weighed, numbered, and entered into meticulous ledgers. The records were immaculate. They documented not chaos, but order, the kind of order only tyranny could achieve. From the ports of Bordeaux and Marseille, trains carried the gold to Berlin. Inside the Reichsbank's subterranean chambers, the piles grew so large that workers joked the vaults smelled of victory. The vault master, a man named Albert Toms, later testified that he could tell which nation the gold came from by color alone: the red hue of Belgian bars, the pale tone of Dutch, the rich glow of French bullion. Europe's diversity melted into uniformity under a single emblem, the swastika. But the Blitzkrieg's financial storm didn't stop with nations. It tore through private banks, churches, and families. In Paris, Jewish jewelers were forced to declare all gold and valuables. In Amsterdam, the diamond trade, one of the oldest in Europe, was liquidated overnight. Anything that glittered became fuel for the Reich. The Nazis even established a new office in Berlin, the Dienststelle Westen, specifically to manage the influx of Western European gold and currency. Its reports to the Reichsbank read like accounting triumphs. Belgium, 223 tons received. France, 754 tons. Total reserves increased by 39%. But every percentage point was a tragedy measured in human cost. Behind the sterile numbers lay the reality of war. Factories in occupied France were stripped to supply the German army. Farmers sold their harvests for worthless marks. Families bartered wedding rings for bread. The gold of nations had been replaced by the paper promises of an occupying power. To the ordinary people of Europe, the Reich wasn't just a military occupier, it was a parasite feeding on their economies. Inflation, shortages, and starvation followed wherever the swastika flew. And yet in Berlin, the illusion of prosperity flourished. Nazi propaganda films showed scenes of glittering vaults and orderly markets, proof they claimed that Germany was the economic heart of Europe. The truth was that the heart was pumping stolen blood. By late 1940, the gold reserves of the Reichsbank had tripled since the start of the war. Officials boasted that the Reich was self-sustaining. In reality, it was cannibalizing the continent. Walter Funk, the man at the helm of the Reichsbank, became one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi hierarchy. He was no soldier, no strategist, but he understood the true nature of power control of money. Under his direction, every shipment of looted gold was assigned to coded accounts. One was used for war materials, another for foreign exchange, and another, known only to a few, for the SS. It was this secret account that would soon fund the unthinkable, because while the armies of the Reich plundered Europe's banks, the SS was preparing to plunder its people. The Blitzkrieg's external conquest had filled the Reich's vaults with the gold of nations. The next phase would fill them with the gold of victims. The turning point came in 1942 under a new directive codenamed Operation Reinhardt. It would extend the financial logic of Blitzkrieg into the darkest corners of human morality. The same bureaucrats who managed national gold reserves would soon be counting fillings, rings, and watches from the mouths and pockets of murdered civilians. It was the ultimate perversion of bookkeeping, where the raw material of genocide was measured in ounces and Reichsmarks. But in 1940, the men of the Reichsbank saw none of that. They were too busy congratulating themselves on their success. To them, gold meant stability, power, and permanence. They believed they were building an empire so economically dominant that no army could ever defeat it. They didn't realize that every bar of gold they stacked carried a curse, the weight of the lives and nations they had crushed to obtain it. And somewhere deep in the vaults of Berlin, beneath concrete and steel, that curse was growing heavier with each shipment that arrived. For a time, the Reich seemed unstoppable, but history would prove that even the most perfectly balanced ledger can hide an infinite debt. Operation Reinhardt, the gold of the dead. By 1942, Europe had been carved up, its nations subdued, its treasuries emptied. Yet inside the Reich, the hunger for gold remained unquenched. The Blitzkrieg had filled Berlin's vaults with the wealth of countries. Now the Nazi machine turned inward toward a new and far darker source: human beings. The transformation began quietly disguised as administration. Somewhere between the language of property seizure and state reallocation, the concept of ownership ceased to exist for those the regime had marked for death. Jews, Roma, the disabled, and political prisoners were stripped not just of their rights, but of their possessions, everything from their homes to the coins in their pockets. This next phase of plunder had a name. It was called Operation Reinhardt. The code name honored Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, who had been assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in 1942. In his memory, or perhaps as revenge, the SS designed a system of extermination so efficient it would transform human life itself into a commodity. Under Operation Reinhardt, the SS created a network of death camps across occupied Poland, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek. These were not prisons or labor camps. They were factories built for one purpose: to kill. And, like any factory, they produced byproducts: clothing, hair shoes, watches, jewelry, and gold. In SS reports, this was referred to as Vermogensverwertung, asset utilization. To the bureaucrats of the Reich, even murder had an economic dimension. From the moment deportees arrived, every detail was engineered for extraction. Prisoners were told to undress for disinfection. Their clothes were piled in warehouses called Canada, a cruel nickname that mocked the supposed land of endless wealth. Guards combed through the garments, cutting open seams, shaking out hems, searching for hidden coins or wedding rings. But the most horrific plunder happened after death. When the gas chambers were emptied, work crews themselves, prisoners doomed to be executed, later were ordered to remove the gold fillings from the mouths of the dead. Teeth crowns and bridges were pried out with pliers. In some camps, the SS Dental Corps even established makeshift laboratories to melt down the gold on site. This was not random brutality. It was organized theft carried out with medical precision. Every gram of extracted gold was accounted for, logged, and sent to Berlin. From 1942 onward, these shipments were processed through a company called Degussa, short for Deutsche Gold- und Silberscheideanstalt, the German gold and silver refinery. It was one of the most respected firms in Europe, a century-old business that prided itself on purity. Under contract with the SS Degussa, melted the victim's gold into uniform bars, erasing all trace of its origin. Once recast, the bars were sent to the Reichsbank, where they were deposited into a special account managed by the SS Economic and Administrative Office. The account bore a mundane name, Melmer. It was named after SS Major Bruno Melmer, the officer tasked with delivering the deposits. Between 1942 and 1945, Melmer made at least 80 deliveries to the Reichsbank's headquarters in Berlin. Each shipment contained gold, silver, and currency looted from the extermination camps. According to surviving Reichsbank records, the Melmer account processed over 140 million Reichsmarks worth of valuables, hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. That figure does not include what was lost, hidden, or smuggled. Inside the Reichsbank, the process was disturbingly routine. Clerks accepted the SS deliveries as if they were normal business transactions. They issued receipts, stored the bullion, and transferred the funds into accounts controlled by the SS. The bars were indistinguishable from any others, melted into anonymity. Gold from wedding rings and dental fillings financed bullets, uniforms, and fuel for the very trains that carried their owners to death. There is a chilling efficiency in those ledgers. The handwriting is neat, the sums exact, the signatures tidy. No bloodstains, no guilt, just numbers on paper. Evil disguised as bookkeeping. Even among the Nazis, some bankers privately expressed unease. One internal memo from a Reichsbank official in 1943 noted the source of certain deposits may be questionable, yet nothing changed. The gold was too valuable, the war too costly, the machine too large to stop. And so the theft continued. By the end of 1943, the Reich was receiving shipments of victim gold nearly every month. SS officers joked that the Reichsbank was the safest bank in the world, even for the dead. But nothing about it was safe. The moral collapse within the institution mirrored the physical collapse soon to come. Outside the bank's marble walls, the war was turning against Germany. Stalingrad had fallen. Allied bombers darkened the skies over Berlin. And yet, even as the Reich began to crumble, its bureaucrats continued to count, catalog, and store the gold of the murdered. To the victims, this transformation was total. They were stripped not only of life, but of identity. Their names were replaced by serial numbers, their bodies reduced to raw material, their gold fillings converted into military currency. What was once sacred, a wedding ring, a family heirloom, a tooth that once carried a smile, became mere weight in a ledger. One survivor of Majdanek later said, "They took our lives, but they wanted our breath too." She wasn't exaggerating. The SS even collected human hair for use in textiles, human ashes for fertilizer. Nothing was wasted. Operation Reinhardt was not just genocide. It was an economy of death, the ultimate realization of a system that saw profit in every corpse. When Allied investigators later examined the Reichsbank's vaults, they found bags of gold rings, eyeglass frames, and dentures still marked with the stains of human enamel. Each piece told a story that could no longer be spoken, and yet within the Reich itself, no one dared to question it. To object was to vanish. Silence was survival. By 1944, the total amount of gold processed from victims was estimated to equal several $100 million small compared to the national reserves of Europe, but enormous in moral weight. It was enough to fund munitions factories, pay for the construction of new camps, and sustain the Reich's war machine, even as the front lines collapsed. The moral irony was unbearable. A regime that dehumanized millions depended on the wealth taken from their bodies to survive. In Berlin, Walter Funk, the Reichsbank president, continued to sign off on the deposits. Later, at the Nuremberg trials, when asked whether he knew the origin of the gold, Funk claimed ignorance. The tribunal didn't believe him. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the gold itself, melted, mixed, and sold, could never be untangled from the global markets it entered. That was perhaps the cruelest twist of all. The victims' gold did not vanish into myth or legend. It was recast, circulated, and absorbed into the bloodstream of the world economy. It became invisible. To this day, no one can say with certainty where those atoms of gold reside in jewelry in central banks, in the vaults of nations that still measure their wealth by weight and purity. Every bar of gold tells a story, but this story has no ending, because the real legacy of Operation Reinhardt is not the metal itself, but the question it left behind: how a civilization could transform murder into arithmetic, and how an entire bureaucracy could confuse efficiency with virtue. The ledgers were balanced, the books were clean, but the numbers were written in ash. The Swiss connection: how neutrality became the perfect disguise. For centuries, Switzerland had cultivated an image of immaculate neutrality, a mountain fortress above the fray of history. Its Red Cross flag meant refuge, its banks meant trust. In the middle of a Europe tearing itself apart, it stood like a citadel of order and discretion. But by the middle of the Second World War, that neutrality had become something else, entirely a mask. Behind the mountain passes and polite diplomacy, Switzerland had become the banker of the Third Reich. From the first days of the war, German officials at the Reichsbank understood a simple truth: they could steal all the gold in Europe, but they couldn't spend it without help. The gold carried fingerprints, national emblems, serial numbers, even unique coloring from its original minting. Any direct attempt to sell it on international markets would expose the theft and provoke diplomatic chaos. They needed a laundromat large enough, respectable enough to cleanse the evidence, and there nestled between the Alps was the perfect one. Switzerland's central bank, the Swiss National Bank, or SNB, had maintained business relationships with Germany long before the war. Its president, Ernst Weber, was a respected financier known for his pragmatism. In Berlin, Walter Funk, the Reichsbank president, referred to Weber as a man who understands realities. The realities were clear. Germany paid in gold. Switzerland asked no questions. Beginning in 1939, shipments of Nazi gold began crossing the border into Switzerland by train. Some arrived from Berlin, others from Vienna, Prague, and Brussels. Stolen wealth from conquered nations melted down and recast. At the border stations of Basel and Zurich, Swiss customs agents recorded the entries with bureaucratic detachment. The destination was always the same, the vaults of the SNB, and several private banks, including UBS and Credit Suisse. There, in the quiet efficiency of Swiss banking, the gold was given a new identity. Bars stamped with foreign insignias were smelted again. Those bearing the eagle of the Reich were melted, refined, and poured into new molds. The old markings disappeared, replaced by a neutral stamp, the seal of a Swiss bank. Clean, untraceable. The process was called refining, but it was more than metallurgy. It was moral alchemy, transforming stolen blood into legitimate wealth. Once laundered, the gold entered the world market. Switzerland sold it to neutral countries like Portugal, Spain, and Sweden, who used it to settle trade balances or purchase industrial materials. The profits cycled back to Berlin as foreign currency: Swiss francs, Swedish kroner, Spanish pesetas. Those currencies were then used to buy the very materials Germany needed to keep its war machine alive: tungsten for armor-piercing shells, iron ore for tanks' ball bearings for aircraft engines. The Reich paid for its weapons with the jewelry of the dead. To outside observers, Switzerland's neutrality appeared intact. The trains rolled through its valleys. Its diplomats shook hands in Geneva. Its cities hosted Red Cross offices and humanitarian agencies. But in the quiet rooms of Zurich's banking district, the war had no morality, only balance sheets. Allied intelligence noticed. By 1943, reports reached Washington and London suggesting that German gold was being funneled through Swiss banks. The U.S. Treasury Department, led by Henry Morgenthau Jr., began tracking the shipments. British intelligence intercepted coded communications from Berlin to Bern. What they found was damning detailed instructions on converting looted gold into usable assets. In July of that year, the Allies issued a formal warning known as the Declaration on Gold Purchases from the Enemy. It stated that any country or institution buying or trading in looted gold would face post-war consequences. The Swiss response was silence. Officially, they claimed ignorance. Privately, they doubled down. Swiss officials argued that verifying the origin of gold was impossible and that refusing transactions might compromise their neutrality. In truth, neutrality had become a business strategy, a convenient shield for profit. Trains continued to arrive. In some months, shipments totaled over 20 tons. By 1945, the Swiss National Bank alone had received more than $400 million worth of gold from Germany, equivalent to roughly 360 tons. The vast majority of it had been stolen. Swiss bankers weren't the only ones who benefited. Their economy flourished during the war. Swiss factories supplied both sides with tools, watches, and precision instruments. Their railways carried goods across borders. Their telegraph lines connected warring nations. Switzerland became, in effect, the financial switchboard of Europe's destruction. For ordinary Swiss citizens, life remained peaceful. Their cities were untouched by bombs, their fridges full, their sons alive. The war was something that happened elsewhere out there beyond the mountains. But in truth, the war's blood flowed beneath their feet in vaults cooled by alpine air. The moral blindness wasn't unique to bankers. It was national. When Allied diplomats pressed Swiss leaders about the gold, They replied with phrases like economic necessity and international impartiality. But neutrality that feeds on stolen gold isn't neutrality at all. It's quiet complicity. As 1944 approached, the Reich grew desperate. The Allied bombing campaign devastated Germany's infrastructure. Factories lay in ruins, rail lines shattered. Yet somehow, Germany kept trading, kept buying from neutral nations, and it was Swiss gold that made it possible. Every bar that crossed the Alps was another week of war, another 1,000 lives lost. Then, in early 1945, the inevitable began. The Reich cities burned, and Berlin prepared for the end. Still, the trains to Switzerland kept running. The last documented delivery occurred in March, mere weeks before Hitler's suicide. Even as the regime collapsed, its bankers continued to ship stolen treasure, clinging to the illusion of solvency. When the fighting finally stopped, the Swiss vaults were full, and Europe was in ruins. The nations whose gold had been stolen, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, Poland, were bankrupt. Millions of families had nothing left but ashes. Switzerland emerged from the war richer than ever. Its gold reserves had doubled. Its economy was intact. And in the years immediately after, it presented itself once again as the beacon of stability in a chaotic world. But the ghosts of that gold were not easily buried. In 1946, Allied investigators traced records from the Reichsbank and found precise logs of shipments to Switzerland. The evidence was overwhelming. Confronted Swiss officials admitted to mistakes, but insisted they had acted in good faith. Their defense rested on technicalities, that they had no way to know the gold was looted, that they had merely followed standard procedure. The Allies, exhausted by war and facing the new threat of Soviet expansion, chose pragmatism over punishment. In 1946, they signed the Washington Agreement with Switzerland. The deal required the Swiss to pay 150 million Swiss francs, about 58 million US dollars, into a restitution fund for the victims of Nazi looting. It was less than 1/6 of the gold they had taken in. The case was closed, officially at least. For the next 50 years, the story of Switzerland's wartime gold remained buried under the same silence that had protected it during the war. Banks sealed their archives. Governments looked the other way. The world moved on to reconstruction, to the Cold War, to new wars and new profits. But the gold remained. It always does. Beneath the rhetoric of neutrality lay the unspoken truth. Switzerland's mountains did not merely shelter peace, they sheltered guilt. And in those years after the war, when the world began to rebuild, the question lingered in the background, like a whisper in a vault. If a neutral country can profit from atrocity and call it neutrality, what does neutrality even mean? Ignored warnings when the Allies knew and chose silence. By 1943, the world knew. In Washington, London, and Ottawa, Allied intelligence officers had already pieced together the web of financial deceit behind the Nazi war machine. They had traced the trails of gold shipments, intercepted diplomatic cables, and even possessed detailed lists of Reichsbank transfers to Swiss institutions. The evidence was overwhelming. The banks of neutrality were laundering the profits of mass murder. But knowing and acting are two different things. And in wartime, morality is often a luxury few nations can afford. Inside the U.S. Treasury Department Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. pored over reports from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS forerunner to the CIA. The documents described how the Swiss National Bank and several private firms were accepting shipments of gold marked with the emblems of occupied nations, the lion of the Netherlands, the trident of Belgium, the rooster of France. Even more disturbing were the accounts from within Germany itself, references to gold arriving from the SS marked only as special transactions. Morgenthau was furious. To him, the evidence was clear. The Swiss were complicit. He urged President Roosevelt to take action to freeze Swiss assets in the United States, to issue a public condemnation to sever financial relations. But the State Department hesitated. There were other considerations. The war in Europe was reaching a turning point. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Italy and planning the D-Day assault in France. They needed access to the financial and communication channels that only neutral countries like Switzerland could provide. Swiss telegraphs carried coded messages between Allied diplomats and resistance networks inside occupied Europe. Swiss factories produced precision instruments used in Allied aircraft. Even humanitarian organizations like the International Red Cross operated out of Geneva. To close the door on Switzerland, the Allies feared would mean closing a vital artery of information and logistics. So they compromised, and with that compromise came silence. In London, similar debates unfolded. British intelligence had known about the Reich's laundering operations since 1942. Bank of England analysts warned that Swiss transactions were prolonging the war by months, maybe years. Yet the British Treasury refused to act. The reasoning was brutally pragmatic. If the Swiss stop buying, one official wrote in a confidential memo, Germany will simply sell through others, Spain, Portugal, or Sweden. It is better to know the channel than to drive it underground. Better to let the laundering continue and watch it than to lose sight of it altogether. It was the kind of logic that always thrives in war, the belief that control is more important than conscience. But not everyone agreed. Within the U.S. government, a young Treasury lawyer named Randolph Paul began compiling internal reports documenting the complicity of neutral banks. His findings painted an appalling picture, not only of the Swiss, but of Allied indifference. In one memo he wrote, "Every bar of gold that crosses that border carries with it the ashes of a human being." The memo never made it past the internal review stage. By the time Allied bombers were reducing German cities to rubble, the Reich's financial operations were still intact. The trains to Switzerland still ran on time. The vaults of Zurich and Bern still opened their doors to receive deliveries. Even after the U.S. issued its 1943 warning, declaring that it would not recognize any gold transactions originating from occupied Europe, the Swiss ignored it. Why? Because they knew the Allies wouldn't enforce it. The truth was harsh. Both sides needed the illusion of Swiss neutrality. The Germans needed it to hide their crimes. The Allies needed it to maintain their channels. Neutrality in that sense was the war's most useful lie. By early 1945, Allied troops were pushing into Germany from the west, the Soviets closing from the east. The end was near, yet the financial machinery of the Reich, stripped, desperate, but still functioning, continued to hum. In February, as Allied bombers reduced Berlin to ruins, Walter Funk ordered the evacuation of the Reichsbank's remaining gold. It was sent to a mine in the heart of Germany, hidden deep underground. He called it a temporary relocation. The gold that remained in Switzerland, however, was safe, untouchable. And the Allies, even as they liberated concentration camps and uncovered the horrors of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, did not seize Swiss assets. The issue was deferred, postponed, wrapped in diplomatic caution. When the war ended, the same restraint continued. The Allied nations met in Paris in 1946 to discuss restitution and reparation. They formed the Tripartite Commission for the Restitution of Monetary Gold, tasked with recovering and redistributing the wealth stolen by the Nazis. But the Commission's mandate stopped at national gold, the reserves of governments, not the possessions of individual victims. The victims' gold, the rings, the teeth, the jewelry, the melted bars from the camps was labeled non-monetary. And with that single bureaucratic distinction, it slipped quietly out of history. The Allies had the chance to draw a clear moral line to expose not only the Nazi plunder, but the financial systems that enabled it. Instead, they settled for convenience. The world wanted to move on. The Cold War had already begun to cast its shadow across Europe. The Western Allies needed Switzerland now more than ever as a trading partner, an intelligence hub, and a buffer between East and West. The gold in Swiss vaults was a problem best forgotten. For nearly half a century that silence held. It would take generations' lawsuits and the courage of survivors to break it. Looking back, it is easy to condemn the bankers who took the gold. Harder, perhaps, to face the governments that knew and looked away. Because the truth is, history's moral failures are rarely born of ignorance. They are born of convenience. And in 1943, convenience outweighed conscience. The flight from Berlin. Hiding the gold before the fall. February 1945. Berlin was burning. The city that once glittered with imperial ambition had become a charred skeleton under a red sky. Allied bombers swept over it night after night, turning the capital of the Reich into rubble. The air smelled of dust smoke and despair. Deep beneath the ruined streets, inside the fortified vaults of the Reichsbank, the last great treasure of the Nazi Empire, still waited hundreds of tons of gold, silver, and foreign currency. For years, this underground chamber had been the silent witness to the greatest theft in human history. Now it was a liability, the physical proof of that crime. And the men who had stolen it knew that the end was coming. By late January, the Red Army had crossed the Oder River. American forces were advancing from the west. The Reich, hemmed in on both sides, was collapsing in on itself. Inside the walls of the Reichsbank, the mood was one of quiet panic. Walter Funk, the bank's president, called an emergency meeting. The discussion was brief and desperate. The gold must be moved. It was not only about preservation, it was about self-preservation. Anyone left standing near that gold when the Allies arrived would have to answer for it. So in the first week of February, a new operation began. The Reich's remaining reserves, more than 90% of its gold, along with foreign currency, art, and precious stones, were loaded onto trains under strict secrecy. 13 trains in total, each one guarded by armed SS units. The plan was simple: get the treasure out of Berlin, out of sight, and deep underground. The destination was a small town in central Germany called Murkers. Nearby stood an immense salt and potassium mine, the Kaiserode mine, 200 feet below the surface. The tunnels stretched for miles, dry and stable, ideal for long-term storage. In normal times, it had produced fertilizer. In 1945, it became a tomb for stolen gold. The trains rolled out of Berlin in the dead of night. To the few witnesses who saw them, they looked like ordinary military transports, freight cars sealed under black tarps moving south through a dying empire. The engineers were given no details. Only the highest-ranking SS officers knew what the trains carried. On arrival at Murkers, the crates were unloaded and taken down into the mine's lower chambers. Room number 8, a vast hall carved out of salt rock, was chosen as the vault. There, under the flickering light of lanterns, hundreds of men stacked gold bars, canvas sacks, and boxes of currency. Some crates held the marks of the Belgian and Dutch banks. Others bore the eagles of the Reich. A few contained smaller sacks labeled simply dental gold. They worked for days, walling the chamber with thick plaster once it was filled. When the job was done, the entrance was sealed. No records were kept. No witnesses survived for long. Above ground, the Third Reich continued its death spiral. Cities fell, armies crumbled, and Hitler retreated into his bunker. Yet even as defeat consumed the nation, its leaders clung to one last illusion, that their gold, their stolen treasure, would somehow save them. Walter Funk issued new orders from Berlin. Smaller caches of gold were to be hidden across Germany and Austria in caves, monasteries, even mountain lakes. The Reich's wealth was to be scattered like ashes before the wind. He called it strategic dispersal. It was, in truth, an act of desperation. In April 1945, the first Allied troops reached Thuringia, the region surrounding Murkers. They came from the West soldiers of the U.S. Third Army led by General George S. Patton. They expected resistance. What they found instead was surrender. The local German officials laid down their arms without a fight. Among the civilians was a pair of French women, forced laborers, who had spent months working in the nearby salt mines. When questioned by American military police, they told a strange story. A trainload of gold had arrived in February, guarded by SS troops and hidden deep underground. Few believed them at first, but when the women described the exact location, room number 8, sealed with plaster, the officers decided to investigate. On April 7, 1945, U.S. troops descended into the Murkers mine. Their flashlights cut through the darkness of the tunnels, illuminating walls that shimmered with salt crystals. After hours of searching, they found the sealed chamber. The plaster was fresh. The air behind it was still. With explosives, they blew open the wall. What they saw stunned them into silence. Rows upon rows of gold bars stacked to the ceiling. Canvas sacks filled with gold coins from 15 different nations, wooden crates packed with bullion, and in one corner, 8 burlap sacks containing gold rings, watches, and teeth, the remnants of people who had vanished into smoke. Nearby were millions in foreign currency, 2.7 billion Reichsmarks, 100 million French francs, several million US dollars, and piles of British pounds, Dutch guilders, and Norwegian kroner. In total, the haul was beyond comprehension, the combined plunder of an entire continent. And that wasn't all. Another section of the mine held hundreds of crates labeled art. Inside were paintings by Rembrandt, Raphael, Renoir, and Dürer. Priceless sculptures, ancient manuscripts, and gold-plated chalices from cathedrals lay side by side with the spoils of modern war. It was as if Europe's soul had been buried under salt. When General Patton received the report, he flew to Murkers immediately. Accompanied by General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, he walked through the tunnels, his flashlight beams sweeping over the mountain of treasure. Even men hardened by years of combat were shaken by what they saw. Patton later wrote in his diary, "It was the greatest treasure hoard ever discovered, and the ugliest." Eisenhower ordered the entire site placed under heavy guard. The gold was cataloged, photographed, and eventually transported to the Reichsbank's former branch in Frankfurt for safekeeping. Allied intelligence officers began tracing each bar, attempting to determine its origin. Many bore marks from the central banks of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Others, none at all. Those investigators suspected had come from the concentration camps. As the news spread, journalists dubbed it the Nazi gold mine. Photographs of soldiers standing knee-deep in bars of gold appeared in newspapers worldwide. It was a spectacle, the physical embodiment of greed and conquest finally unearthed. But amid the awe and the headlines, there was something else, a silence around those smaller sacks in the corner, the ones filled not with bars but with human remnants, the victims' gold. To the soldiers cataloging the weight of those sacks felt heavier than all the bullion in the room. They understood that every ring, every tooth, had once belonged to someone who could never claim it back. The Murkers discovery was more than a victory for the Allies. It was an indictment proof that the war had been fought not only with guns, but with ledgers and vaults. The Nazi Empire had been as much a financial organism as a military one, feeding on the wealth and lives of others. By April 1945, the Reich was dead in all but name. Hitler would be gone within weeks. The gold, however, would live on, parceled out, reclassified, fought over by governments for decades to come. In the salt mine at Murkers, the war ended with a bang of dynamite and the echo of human greed. And as the soldiers climbed back to the surface, the sun rising over a defeated nation, one question lingered in the dust. If this is what they buried, what else still lies hidden beneath our feet? The Murkers, treasure, and the price of truth. When the doors of room number 8 burst open, the world's greatest hidden fortune saw light for the first time. 2,000 feet underground in the still air of the Murker salt mine, Allied soldiers stood frozen, their flashlights reflecting off walls of gold. What they had uncovered was not treasure in the romantic sense, not the stuff of legends or lost maps, but a monument to greed, death, and precision. It was as if an empire's conscience had been buried and preserved in salt. The official inventory took days. Teams of U.S. Army accountants, engineers, and intelligence officers descended into the mine, working by floodlight to count, weigh, and record every bar. By the end of April 1945, their ledgers told the story that the Reich had tried to erase. 7,115 gold bars, 8 burlap sacks filled with jewelry, wedding rings, and gold teeth, canvas bags containing coins from 15 nations, stacks of foreign currency worth billions in modern dollars, and more than 400 tons of looted art masterpieces by Rembrandt, Raphael, Renoir, Dürer, and dozens more. To the soldiers who witnessed it, it felt surreal, a silent tomb of civilization's beauty and horror sealed together in the same place. General Eisenhower arrived in person to see it. He walked slowly through the chamber, his boots crunching on the salt floor. His flashlight stopped on the sacks of victims' gold, the small human remnants among the mountains of metal. One of his aides later recalled him saying quietly, "This is why we fight." The next day, Eisenhower ordered journalists and photographers into the mine. He wanted the world to see, to have proof in pictures of the crimes that had fueled this war. The images that emerged would be printed in newspapers across the globe. American soldiers standing ankle-deep in gold bars, others uncrating paintings, a small group of men staring at bags of rings that once symbolized love and now testified to atrocity. For a brief moment, the myth of the lost Nazi treasure became reality, except this treasure was not lost. It had been hidden in plain sight, shielded by bureaucracy, secrecy, and silence. But for every discovery like Murkers, there were countless others that never came to light. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, they began uncovering smaller caches, gold hidden in churches, buried in forests, even dumped in lakes. In Austria, divers exploring Lake Toplitz found crates filled with counterfeit British banknotes, part of Operation Bernhard, a Nazi plan to flood the British economy with fake currency. But the rumored chests of gold at the lake's bottom, they were never found. Near the Buchenwald concentration camp, investigators discovered a buried stash of gold and platinum, much of it composed of dental gold, melted and mixed beyond recognition. Everywhere the Allies dug, they found pieces of the same puzzle fragments of a crime so vast, it blurred the line between theft and annihilation. The Murkers mine became the central deposit for these finds. Under U.S. supervision, its contents were transported to Frankfurt, where a new question arose. What should be done with the gold? In 1946, the United States, Britain, and France formed a special body, the Tripartite Commission for the Restitution of Monetary Gold. Its mission was to collect all recovered Nazi gold, pool it together, and return it to the central banks of the countries from which it had been stolen. It sounded simple. It wasn't. The Allies had recovered roughly 337 tons of monetary gold, an enormous amount, but less than 1/3 of what Germany had looted. The rest had vanished into the Swiss banking system, been traded for raw materials, or melted into anonymity. 10 nations filed claims to the gold pool: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and others. Each demanded restitution in proportion to what had been taken. But the math didn't work. The vaults were too empty, the losses too vast. So the commission divided the gold by percentages, turning suffering into arithmetic. Each nation received a share smaller than what it had lost. But there was a deeper injustice hidden within this process, one written in the fine print. The Tripartite Commission only handled monetary gold, meaning gold stolen from central banks. The other gold, the non-monetary gold, was excluded. The victims' gold, the rings, the watches, the melted dental gold from the concentration camps. In the ledgers of the new post-war order, those human remnants were treated as a separate category, their value estimated at a mere $5 million a pittance compared to the billions in national reserves. The commission ruled that this non-monetary gold would be used for relief and resettlement of surviving victims. In practice, almost none of it ever reached them. Most of it was mixed back into the monetary pool and returned to governments, not people. The individual victims of Nazism, the ones whose gold fillings had paid for bullets and gas, were forgotten once more, not out of malice, but out of paperwork. For every recovered bar of gold, there was an empty grave somewhere in Europe. The Murkers' treasure, cataloged and stored, became the foundation of the new post-war restitution system. It was both triumph and tragedy proof that justice could be measured but never fully delivered. In the years that followed, investigators tried to trace what was left: the missing shipments, the secret accounts, the gold that had disappeared into private hands. Some believed it was hidden in the mountains of southern Germany, others that it had been smuggled through the rat lines, the escape networks that carried SS officers to South America. Stories surfaced of submarines filled with gold bound for Argentina, of trains sealed in tunnels of chests buried under alpine lakes. Most were myths, but myths endure when truth is unsatisfying. And the truth was, the majority of Nazi gold had not vanished into mystery. It had simply been absorbed, laundered, traded, spent. By 1945, much of it was already circulating through the post-war economy, invisible, but everywhere. For ordinary Germans, the discovery at Murkers brought no comfort. Their cities were in ruins, their families displaced, their nation shamed. For the survivors of the camps, it brought no closure. What good was gold returned to governments when the lives it was taken from could never be restored? Even among the Allied soldiers who uncovered it, there was unease. They had witnessed the tangible weight of evil, a mountain of evidence that proved the war had not just been fought on battlefields, but in vaults and balance sheets. A lieutenant who guarded the mine for several weeks wrote home, "We found the gold, but it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a confession." And perhaps that is what the Murkers' treasure truly was: a confession carved into metal, a silent acknowledgement that the war had not only been about armies and ideology, but about the oldest sin of all, the hunger for wealth and power at any cost. The Reich had fallen, the vaults had been opened, the world had its proof. But as the Allies celebrated victory in Europe, Few realized how much of the stolen fortune had already slipped through their fingers, how much had crossed borders under the banner of neutrality, melted into respectability, and entered the bloodstream of global finance. The Murkers mine would later become a museum piece, a historical footnote. But the gold it once held that in 1,000 different forms still circulates the world. You might hold a piece of it in your hand one day, a ring, a coin, a bar of bullion, without ever knowing where it came from. And that perhaps is the cruelest legacy of all, that something so precious could be born from something so vile, and that time like salt could bury even the memory of its origins. The post-war reckoning, justice, accounting, and amnesia. The war was over, but the silence was not. In the ruins of Europe, people searched for loved ones, for homes, for meaning. But others searched for something else, the stolen gold. Every bar, every coin, every melted ounce was a relic of a crime that had financed destruction. The Allies had uncovered the evidence in mines caves and hidden depots. Now they faced a question few had the courage to ask. How do you return what was taken when its origins are soaked in blood? In 1946, the Tripartite Commission for the Restitution of Monetary Gold began its work. It was meant to be a triumph of moral reconstruction, a gesture of order amid the ashes. Britain, France, and the United States oversaw it. Their mission was to gather all the Nazi gold recovered by the Allies and redistribute it to the nations that had been robbed. On paper, it sounded just. In reality, it became a ledger of loss. The total amount recovered, roughly 337 tons, was less than a third of what the Reich had stolen from Europe's central banks. Countries filed desperate claims backed by documents, by witnesses, by pleas. France wanted 754 tons returned, Belgium 223, the Netherlands 163, Poland 75, Austria 78. But arithmetic has no empathy. There wasn't enough to go around. So the Allies did what bureaucracies always do when faced with the impossible. They compromised. Each claimant nation would receive a share from the gold pool proportional to its documented losses. It was an accountant's solution to a moral catastrophe. France received less than half of what had been taken. Smaller nations received fragments. Poland, already swallowed by Soviet influence, barely received anything at all. But the real injustice lay hidden between the lines of those official decrees. The Commission defined its scope narrowly: monetary gold only. In other words, gold belonging to states and banks. The other gold, the personal property of the murdered, was written off as non-monetary. Its value, estimated at just over $2.5 million, was treated like debris in the margins of an empire's balance sheet. This victim's gold was to be used, they said, for humanitarian relief, to aid survivors to rebuild lives. But little of it ever reached them. The paperwork tangled the funds, evaporated the responsibility, diffused across governments and committees, until there was nothing left but silence. Once again, the dead were lost in the bureaucracy of the living. Meanwhile, the world moved on. Nations were rebuilding. Cities rose from rubble. The Cold War dawned, and with it came new priorities. Western Europe needed stability, not introspection. The Allies needed Germany's economy revived, not humiliated. And they needed Switzerland, that tiny, untouched island of finance, as a neutral intermediary in a world split by ideology. So the great questions of moral accountability were quietly shelved. The Washington Agreement of 1946 settled the immediate dispute with Switzerland. The Swiss agreed to pay 150 million Swiss francs, about 58 million US dollars, into the restitution fund. In exchange, the Allies promised to consider the matter closed. It was a diplomatic handshake over a grave. No one mentioned that Switzerland had received over $400 million in stolen gold during the war, much of it melted and sold unrecoverable. No one wanted to jeopardize the fragile New World Order taking shape. The age of moral reckoning gave way to the age of pragmatism. And so the story of the Nazi gold slipped beneath the surface once again, this time not hidden in mines, but buried under paperwork and politics. Walter Funk, the Reichsbank president who had overseen the looting, was arrested and tried at Nuremberg. He sat in the same courtroom as the generals and ministers who had planned genocide. When prosecutors confronted him with the records of the Melmer account, the account where the SS had deposited the gold taken from concentration camp victims, Funk claimed ignorance. "I was only a banker," he said. "I did not know the origin of the deposits." It was a lie, but a familiar one, the refrain of bureaucrats who saw morality as a line item, not a boundary. Funk was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Sentenced to life imprisonment, he was released after 10 years for medical reasons. He lived quietly in Germany until his death in 1960. The company that had melted the victims' gold, Degussa, resumed business after the war and grew into one of the world's largest metal refiners. Its wartime history was reduced to a footnote. That too was part of the reckoning, or rather the absence of it. Across Europe, governments prioritized reconstruction over remembrance. The Marshall Plan flooded Western nations with American aid. New currencies were printed, new alliances formed. The narrative shifted from guilt to growth. There was no room for the ghosts of gold. By the 1950s, most of the Tripartite Commission's work was administrative closing accounts, settling minor disputes, signing off on deliveries. The remaining disputes dragged on until the late 1990s. In the end, the final tally read like an accountant's epitaph. Of the 337 tons recovered, all but 5.5 tons had been returned to governments. Less than 2% was designated as victims' gold. And with that, the books were closed. The world congratulated itself for having settled the matter. But what does it mean to settle a debt like that? Can justice be measured by tonnage or fractions of bullion? Can you truly return gold that was once extracted from a human body, from a ring, worn in faith or love, from the teeth of a murdered child? For many survivors, the answer was clear. You cannot repay what was stolen from the soul. In post-war Europe, the survivors of the camps struggled to rebuild their lives with nothing but memory. Some received small reparations, others nothing. When they heard about the massive gold recoveries, the commissions, and the diplomatic agreements, many felt hollow. The scale of theft was incomprehensible, but the scale of indifference was even greater. And yet, for decades, the subject remained taboo. The gold became a metaphor for something deeper, the world's willingness to normalize the unthinkable, to turn atrocity into data, to translate moral loss into numbers that fit neatly on a page. It would take half a century before that silence cracked again, before a new generation began to ask, where did it all go? The reckoning had been postponed, but not erased. The gold was out of sight, but not out of time. History, like debt, always waits to be repaid. Switzerland's silence, the 50-year cover-up, and the awakening of the 1990s. For half a century, the vault stayed closed, and so did the mouths. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Switzerland emerged from the war, untouched, its cities whole, its economy booming, its banks swollen with deposits from every side of the conflict. The world was rebuilding. Switzerland was already rich. It portrayed itself as Europe's conscience, a neutral state that had merely survived. But beneath that polished neutrality lay a silence as heavy as the gold it guarded. For decades, the story of the Nazi gold all but vanished from public conversation. The Washington Agreement of 1946 had sealed it. Diplomats eager to turn the page declared the matter resolved. Reporters stopped asking questions. Historians were discouraged from prying. The Swiss government quietly classified wartime banking records under laws protecting financial privacy. And the banks themselves, institutions like UBS Credit Suisse and the Swiss National Bank, perfected the art of discretion. They didn't need to deny, they simply didn't discuss. By the 1950s, the Cold War had transformed Switzerland into a strategic crossroads. Western intelligence agencies used Swiss cities for meetings, financial transfers, and espionage. Swiss neutrality became a shield not only for trade, but for secrecy. The same vaults that had once held Nazi gold now held the accounts of governments, corporations, and individuals from every corner of the divided world. In Geneva, bankers prided themselves on what they called absolute confidentiality. To open a client's file without authorization was a crime punishable by prison. In that atmosphere, the idea of revisiting wartime banking scandals seemed not only inconvenient, but dangerous. Yet the truth lingered locked away in files that refused to decay. Inside those archives were ledgers marked with names long dead: Reichsbank Melmer Degussa. The trails of gold that had once been visible to Allied investigators were buried again, this time under Swiss law. For 50 years, survivors of the Holocaust who tried to reclaim family bank accounts were met with polite indifference. We can find no record of that account, the letters would say. Perhaps it was closed during the war, but the survivors remembered. In the 1980s and early 1990s, as many of them entered their final years, their children and grandchildren began asking questions that their parents had been too broken to ask. What happened to the money, the jewelry, the deposits our families made when they fled? At first, the Swiss banks dismissed these claims as sentimental speculation, but then the documents began to surface. Researchers combing through Allied archives in Washington and London found declassified files from the 1940s evidence that Swiss banks had knowingly accepted looted gold from Germany, and that they had held thousands of dormant accounts belonging to Jewish families who never returned from the camps. One of those files contained a chilling phrase written by an American investigator in 1946: "The Swiss have profited from blood." By 1995, the silence cracked. That year, a group of survivors and their families formed an alliance with the World Jewish Congress, led by Edgar Bronfman. They demanded access to Swiss archives and full restitution for unclaimed wartime accounts. The banks refused. They claimed the records had been lost or destroyed, that too much time had passed. So the survivors went to court. In 1996, a class action lawsuit was filed in the United States against the two largest Swiss banks, UBS and Credit Suisse. The suit accused them of knowingly concealing assets belonging to Holocaust victims and of laundering Nazi gold during the war. The case exploded into international headlines. Suddenly, the Swiss myth of innocence began to crumble. Under growing pressure, the Swiss government established an independent commission to investigate the nation's wartime role. It was called the Bergier Commission, after its chairman historian Jean-François Bergier. For the first time in history, Switzerland opened its archives to scrutiny. Teams of researchers, Swiss, American, Israeli, Polish, and German, were granted access to documents that had been sealed for half a century. What they found shattered the official narrative. Over 5 years of investigation, the Bergier Commission documented the extent of Switzerland's collaboration with Nazi Germany in meticulous detail. They discovered that the Swiss National Bank had purchased at least 440 million Swiss francs worth of gold from the Reichsbank, equivalent to more than 400 million in 1940s currency. and that the bankers had known much of it was looted. They had melted and re-stamped the bars to hide their origin, selling them on the open market and depositing the proceeds into accounts controlled by the Reich. The Swiss, the report concluded, had become the financial hub of the Axis. Even more damning were the revelations about refugee policy. The same government that had accepted the Nazis' gold had turned away thousands of Jewish refugees at its borders, sending them back to occupied territories and certain death. One border officer's memo read, "The boat is full." The report left no room for denial. Switzerland, it stated, provided the Nazi regime with the hard currency it needed to continue the war and profited from the persecution of its victims. It was a national reckoning unlike any the country had ever faced. As the findings were released in 2002, protests broke out across Swiss cities. Politicians demanded apologies. Bank executives resigned. The once untouchable aura of Swiss banking secrecy cracked under the weight of its own history. But the reckoning had begun even earlier in 1998, when the pressure of lawsuits and public outrage forced a settlement. After months of negotiation and under threat of international sanctions, UBS and Credit Suisse agreed to pay $125 billion to Holocaust survivors and their heirs. It was one of the largest class action settlements in history. To some, it was justice delayed, but finally delivered. To others, it was far too little, far too late. The payments, divided among hundreds of thousands of claimants, rarely exceeded a few $1,000s each. But for the survivors, it wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement proof that their memories had not been buried as deeply as the gold. For the Swiss, the moral cost was incalculable. The nation that had prided itself on neutrality had been forced to confront its complicity. Its banks had thrived on blood gold. Its vaults had sheltered evidence of genocide. The final report of the Bergier Commission, released in March 2002, closed with a sentence that still haunts Switzerland today. The neutrality of the Swiss state was not moral, it was commercial. That single line condensed 50 years of silence into one undeniable truth. And yet, even after the apologies, the settlements, and the reports, the full story of the Nazi gold remains incomplete. Much of the wealth that passed through Switzerland during the war had long since been absorbed into the global economy, traded, invested, or transformed into the foundations of modern institutions. The trail had gone cold, but memory is stubborn. In museums and memorials, small exhibitions began to appear. Glass cases containing ledgers, coins, photographs of the Murkers mine, and testimonies of survivors whose family fortunes had vanished behind Swiss bank walls. School textbooks in Switzerland began to include, for the first time, chapters on the nation's wartime dealings. It was a start, not redemption, but recognition. For the survivors who lived to see it, the moment carried a bittersweet weight. They had waited 50 years for someone to listen, and when the truth finally came, it arrived too late for most of them to witness it. But history is not measured only in years. It is measured in what we choose to remember. For half a century, the world let Switzerland's mountains stand as a symbol of purity. The Bergier report replaced that image with a mirror, one reflecting the quiet complicity of a nation that had profited from evil and then built its prosperity atop silence. The vaults were never truly empty. They held something heavier than gold, the weight of denial. And when those vaults finally opened, what spilled out was not treasure, it was the truth. The myths, the missing gold, and the debt that remains unpaid. The war ended, the trials ended, the reports were written, the numbers recorded, the ledgers closed. But the story of the Nazi gold never truly ended, because gold doesn't disappear. It changes form, it travels, it hides in plain sight. For 80 years, the legend has refused to die. Every few years, new rumors surface of hidden caches, lost trains, and buried fortunes. In Poland, treasure hunters still dig near the town of Wałbrzych, chasing whispers of a sealed tunnel said to contain a ghost train loaded with gold and artwork, entombed by retreating Nazis in 1945. The search has yielded nothing but rust and hope, yet the myth endures. In Austria, divers descend into the icy waters of Lake Toplitz, believing they'll find Nazi chests resting on the lakebed. They discover counterfeit currency secret documents, even aircraft wreckage, but never the gold. Each rumor feels like an echo from the past, a story Europe keeps telling itself to make sense of what it cannot face, that the real treasure is not missing at all. It was never buried in tunnels or lakes. It was absorbed, melted, and spent transformed into the invisible wealth of the modern world. The truth is far less cinematic and far more haunting. Most of the Reich's gold was either recovered or successfully laundered during the war. The Murkers mine, the Swiss banks, the smelting furnaces of Degussa, they had already done their work. The bullion entered post-war trade sold to governments and industries, rebuilding the ruins of Europe. Over time, its origins were forgotten. The blood gold of Auschwitz and Treblinka became the foundation for post-war prosperity. The legend of the lost Nazi treasure persists because it offers something the truth does not closure. It promises that one day someone will find the gold, open the vault, and balance the moral books of history. But gold cannot carry morality. It is too heavy, too cold. The real debt was never monetary. It was spiritual. For the families of those who perished, no discovery can restore what was taken. How do you account for a wedding ring melted into anonymity, a tooth turned into currency, a portrait torn from a wall, passed through a dozen hands, and now hanging in a private collection under a different name? Even the grand gestures, the 1998 Swiss bank settlement, the 2002 Bergier report, the museums and memorials feel like fragments compared to the scale of what was lost. The world repaid the debt in money, but the debt itself was measured in memory. And memory, unlike gold, resists ownership. When the Tripartite Commission finally dissolved in 1998, its closing statement was bureaucratic and bloodless. All reasonable restitution has been achieved. The phrase carried the weight of finality as if history could be balanced like a ledger. But behind those words was an unspoken admission that justice in its purest form is impossible. Because how do you repay the past when the system that profited from it still stands? In the decades after the war, the very institutions that handled Nazi gold, the banks, the refineries, the insurers, continued to thrive. Degussa, the company that had melted victims' gold, became one of the world's largest metal refiners. Credit Suisse and UBS became global giants. The Swiss National Bank, whose neutrality had once shielded atrocity, now stands as a cornerstone of international finance. Their histories mention the war years briefly in cautious language, complicated circumstances, transactions under pressure, a different time. The vocabulary of amnesia. Yet gold, for all its shine, does not forget. Every bar carries microscopic traces, impurities, isotopes, fingerprints of geography and time. If we could trace each molecule, it would lead us through the veins of history, from the teeth of a prisoner in Auschwitz, to a Swiss foundry, to a vault in Bern, to a trade deal in Lisbon, to a refinery in London, to a jewelry store in New York. A single ring could contain atoms from 10 different lives. In that sense, the Nazi gold was never lost. It was distributed. It became part of us, a reminder that history is not buried beneath us, but circulating within us. And so the debt remains unpaid. not because it cannot be paid, but because it was never truly acknowledged. The post-war world built its stability on forgetting. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe's cities, but not its conscience. Governments balanced budgets, but ignored the unbalanced souls. Even now, some nations still hold painting sculptures and family heirlooms stolen from Jewish homes, their provenance obscured by generations of polite bureaucracy. Every few years, one resurfaces in a museum, and for a moment, a name long erased is spoken again. Then the silence returns. Justice, when it comes so late, feels more like archaeology than redemption. And yet something persists, a kind of moral archaeology. Historians, archivists, journalists, and descendants keep digging, not for gold, but for truth. Because the truth is the only currency that increases in value with time. The last surviving witnesses of that era are now nearly gone. Soon their memories will pass entirely into the hands of history. When that happens, the story of the Nazi gold of the vaults, the mines, the trains, the silence will belong wholly to us the living. What we do with it will reveal who we are. Maybe that is the final lesson of this tale, that evil doesn't always end in ashes or explosions. Sometimes it ends in ledgers, in transactions, in signatures that look harmless until you realize what they bought. The gold was never just metal. It was a mirror. It reflected what greed can do when stripped of humanity, how civilization at its most sophisticated can disguise theft as policy and genocide as accounting. The myths of lost treasure will continue. People will still search the mountains, and lakes still chase the fantasy of discovery. But the real treasure, the one that matters, is the truth itself, the unrelenting record of how a world's wealth became its shame. And when you hear the next rumor, another Nazi gold train, another sunken U-boat of treasure, remember this: the most valuable things that were stolen in those years weren't bars of gold. They were names, faces, futures. They will never be found at the bottom of a lake or buried in a tunnel. They exist only in memory and in the choices we make to remember them, because the gold of the Reich has long been spent, but the debt it left behind, the moral debt, remains. It is not written in the ledgers of banks or in the archives of governments. It is written in us, and unlike gold, that debt cannot be melted down or erased. It can only be carried and never forgotten.